forward a little bit in our reading today. We're up to last week we were with Solomon, and after Solomon there were some other kings. And there was a prophet named Elijah, who was very, very great and very well known. And his disciple Elisha is what we're talking about today. And I just want to make one comment before we begin, that God is bigger than any of us understand. And we have beliefs, we have things that we think we know as Christians, a God that we believe in. Can we turn that down just a little bit? But God is larger than any one tradition. One of the comments that's on the UCUSA website in reference to evangelism talks about how when we go to evangelize anyone, if they have their own faith, if they're Jewish or they're Muslim or they're Hindu or they're Buddhist, they have other wisdom about God that may inspire us, and that wisdom can come from all sources. When we share our faith, we also have to listen for how God can speak to us through many, many people. So we're going to actually read the scripture, kind of one verse at a time, and talk about it.
2 Kings 5, 1 through 19. Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Aram, was a great man and in high favor with his master, because by him the Lord had given victory to Aram. The man, that's the second sentence. All right. The man, though a mighty warrior, suffered from leprosy. So in just those first two sentences, we've got a lot of information.
What thing is it?
Right here.
Kings 5?
Second Kings.
Huh?
Second Kings.
2 Kings 5.
Yeah, I think it's page 336.
Hang on.
It is.
Okay. And it's 8 through what?
Beginning at chapter 5, where the big 5 is on the left?
Yes.
That's where we're starting to read.
Okay.
So in this first couple of verses, we learn all kinds of things about this guy Naaman. The other thing I was going to comment on is that you have to remember that stories are told for specific listeners. So if you were to just go tell someone a story about making cookies, you wouldn't really expect to have to explain to them what a grocery store was, or what a cookbook was, or how an oven works, or what a measurement, or what kitchen timer is. You assume they know all those things. When we read stories in the Bible, we have to remember that they're thousands of years old, and that people were writing for someone else that didn't know what we knew, but they know other things that we don't know. So, for example, in this first verse, we hear that the king of Aram and his army were victorious. That's all it tells us. But the people who first heard this story would know right away that the people that they were victorious over was Israel, because they had conquered Israel. Right.
And they were Syrians? I believe they were Syrians.
Yes.
And you notice that the Lord used them to have victory over his own people. They really must have angered him for this to happen.
The other thing that's interesting in this first verse is that the king, who is ostensibly one of the most powerful people of the time, doesn't even merit a name in this story. So Naaman, who's going to be the main character in the story, we get his name, but we don't get his king's name. One of the problems with this is that the prophet we're going to talk about, Elisha, he was there through 4 kings in Israel. And the king in Israel later on comes in. He's not named either. So it's really hard to place this story exactly, because it could be over a span of 60 years when Elisha was a prophet. But it's just interesting that they're very powerful in an earthly sense, but not so.
It also mentions that Naaman had leprosy. Now, we know from any studies that we do that lepers were considered to be unclean, Leprosy was a horrible, horrible disease to have, because if you were a leper, you got placed away from society. It was very infectious. It was horrible. It was just a terrible disease to have.
Yes.
And yet Naaman is probably second to his king, and he has leprosy.
Yes. In very fact, yes, we'll get to more about that later. Okay. Now the Arameans, on one of their raids, had taken a young girl captive from the land of Israel, and she served Naaman's wife. So again, this is going to emphasize that it was Israel that they conquered, and this young girl is taken, and neither she nor Naaman's wife merit getting a name, but they are critical for this story.
And also, there must have been a peace treaty made once there was victory. There would have been some sort of a treaty, but there were still skirmishes going on. There were raids being made, and this young woman was captured and taken to Naaman's wife
To serve as a slave.
She said to her mistress, "If only my Lord were with the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy." This makes me think that this girl is sympathetic. She still has her faith. She knows about the prophet of Israel, Elisha. And it is almost through her faith that she says to her mistress, if only, my Lord." She sounds very comfortable where she's at. She's not rebellious. She wants him to be well, which is interesting.
Yes. And her faith is the starting point for this story. If it weren't for this young girl, there would be no story.
Right.
The other thing, stunning thing that I thought about later when I looked at this, not only is it amazing that as a slave who's been conquered, she volunteers this information of how he could be healed, but she speaks very confidently that the prophet would heal him. He's an enemy, but she is certain that if the prophet were there, the prophet would heal him. And that, when you think about that, for a young girl who's probably a nothing, to be making that assumption, it tells you something about the prophet and the prophet's reputation, what the people know about the prophet.
Her assurance that he would do this.
Yes.
Definitely.
So Naaman went in and told his lord just what the girl from the land of Israel had said.
And the king of Aram said, "Go then, and I will send along a letter to the king of Israel." There's no doubt in this. Naaman comes to him, and the king is like, "Go, do this, and I'll send a letter of introduction with you." So there's a lot of unknown faith there,
Yes.
unacknowledged.
Yes, and this also emphasizes when it said that the Lord, his king, found favor with him. The fact that a man with leprosy could come into the room with the king is just sort of boggles the mind.
It does.
And that the king would treat him so well and say, yes. He went, taking with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 sets of garments. Whereas one of the Bible notebooks I looked at said, a huge present. This is a huge amount of gifts and payment.
So, like, a lot of gifts equals one present.
Yeah.
No, that's how I'm going to think about everything.
Well, I think it merits how much Naaman was favored by this king. He brought the letter to the king of Israel, which read, "When this letter reaches you, know that I have sent to you my servant Naaman, that you may cure him of his leprosy." Do you want to read his reaction?
Well, let me say something about that first. When a kingdom was conquered, it stayed a kingdom. It still had a king. and it still was a kingdom in and of itself, but it became a vassal, what's called a vassal. So basically it was like subservient. It was, the king of Aram has his thumb on the king of Israel, okay? It's like, I can't come up with a good example.
The kingdom is like, the kingdom of Israel is like a puppet.
Yes,
for the other guy?
almost like a puppet, yes, because he has to do whatever the king who conquered him says, yes.
Yes.
Yeah, my brain's just focused on that.
There you go. So when the king of Aram writes to the king of Israel, he isn't like asking, could you do this?
You will.
He's saying, do this.
Or like,
Just
do this or punch.
Just do this, yes. And, okay, so his reaction. When the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his clothes and said, am I God to give death or life that this man sends word to me to cure a man of his leprosy? Just look and see how he's trying to pick a quarrel with me. Now, the first time when I used to read this, I used to think, what a wimp. But if you think about the fact that he's been conquered, and that the king of Aram could no doubt wipe him out if he felt like. His nervousness and his sort of knee-jerk reaction makes a lot of sense.
Yes, he really freaked out.
The irony here is, here's another super powerful person, earthly power, and even though this young girl who's a captive knows about the prophet and what the prophet can do, the king is clueless. Absolutely clueless. Doesn't even know who to call to find out what to do.
Right.
Wait, so what's the kingdom called that now rules over Israel?
He doesn't have a name either. They just call him the king of Israel. We don't.
So like the king of
Oh, the king of Aram rules over the king of Israel.
Okay.
We don't have names for
We
either.
don't have anything.
Okay, I'll call him Tweedledum and Tweedledee.
Okay.
But when Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, he sent a message to the king. Why have you torn your clothes? Let him come to me, that he may learn that there is a prophet in Israel. I love that.
A little bit of irony
I
there.
love that.
So
I
A
love
little bit
that.
of sarcasm.
Because I think that, it says when Elisha, man of God, heard, well, they don't have the communication that we have now. So that you say, how did he hear? Well, I feel that God placed it in his consciousness that something was going on, and it had to do with this Naaman. And so he was like, let him come to me so that he will know there is a prophet of God in Israel.
or there was the ancient Channel 5 news there,
No.
like with this, and then there's like a
Well,
little
there's a-
machine in there that's writing everything, and it just throws it and it reaches him.
There's
what's Terry
a
called?
lot of irony here too, because of course he's saying, let him learn that there's a great prophet in Israel, and the king himself still needs to learn that there's a great king in Israel. So Naaman came with his horses and chariots and halted at the entrance of Elisha's house. Elisha sent a messenger,
That's okay, go ahead.
Elisha sent a messenger to him saying, go, wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored, and you shall be clean.
Yeah. So here David comes. I'm not sure, but I think Elisha lived like 100 miles away. So he had traveled all this way to go to Elisha's home, and Elisha doesn't even come to the door to greet him. He just sends a message out. Oh, tell him to go wash in the Jordan 7 times.
What's the
And it's a river, and he'll be healed.
I'm
So,
sorry, I don't know.
it's okay.
Lots of words.
No, he goes to the shoe
so
store.
I mean, but Naaman became angry and went away saying, I thought that for me he would surely come out and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God and would wave his hand over the spot and cure the leprosy. This tells us a lot. That he had a spot of leprosy that was probably hidden under his clothing. And there's a pride there. I would have thought he would have come out and done something grandiose,
Because I'm important.
Well, yeah. So that didn't happen.
Yeah, I think it's really human nature when we think that something's very, very important in our lives, and we want a fuss made over it, and so we get upset when everybody else doesn't see us as being important as they are. We think it belittles us. We really do
What's
think it
leprosy?
belittles us. Leprosy. Well,
Do they get
when you
like
see-
spots?
let me finish. When you see leprosy in the Bible, it refers to some kind of skin disease. Okay, but there's a lot of different ones. What we call leprosy today is one specific kind of thing, but there's multiple skin diseases that kind of got lumped under the term leprosy. But it was a disease that basically ate your skin away.
Eat your skin.
So you would, especially when it got to your face, you were horribly disfigured.
At its worst, you lose your fingers and
Yes.
your toes, and it was a very horrible
You know
disease.
The spider here in Texas where...
Yes.
Brown recluse.
Right.
Well,
Okay,
by
it's like
before
that
it
one
bites
back.
you, the poison goes all
The skin starts to die.
Yeah. So it was that kind of a thing. And it was usually thought to be contagious. In the New Testament, they talk about the lepers always were on the outside of town.
Yeah.
They were always on the outside of town because they were not allowed to live where anyone else lived.
They were unclean.
They were not allowed, they were required to carry a bell to ring so that people would know and not go near them. So it was something that was very feared because there was no cure for it. That's why it's so amazing that he could go into the king and other things like that. So this is how Naaman reacts. He reacts with this great anger, this rage, and he's going to refuse to play along. I mean, it's like, he wants me to do that? That's not important enough for me. That's not what I came here for. And so he's going to not do
Like,
it.
he wants people to wash him.
He wants a big ritual. He wants the prophet to come out and pray over him and say a ritual and something fancy. Yeah.
Now just go bathe in the Michael Jordan store.
Right.
Well, yeah.
How can something so simple cure?
Exactly. If it was this simple, why didn't he just do it back in Aram, where he came from?
But he also says, are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean? He turned and went away in a rage.
Yeah, the Jordan was muddy. It's a much smaller river than the rivers in the country he came
I
from.
got some mud and some shampoo, my body wash, good stuff, and it's so
But his servants approached and said to him, Father, if the prophet had commanded you to do something difficult, would you not have done it? How much more when all he said to you was, wash and be clean? Now his servants don't get named either. Here's another case where the servants are all the people in the very lowest rungs here.
Just like the girl.
The least powerful people and not named, but they're the ones who push this story forward. They're the ones who get him, who teach him and tell him about the prophet, who encourage him to go and who encourage him then to do what the prophet tells him to do.
And it's interesting that in this interpretation, servants call him father,
I found that word.
that he was the head of their household, and he was the father. And so they had great regard for him. He was he was the bounty of their household. It made their lives good. And so it was in their best interest to help him.
Where are we? 14.
So he went down and immersed himself 7 times in the Jordan, according to the word of the man of God. His flesh was restored like the flesh of a young boy, and he was clean.
He's cured.
What if he just had like a dirty spot and that wouldn't go away?
Leprosy is pretty good.
Then he returned to the man of God, he and all his company. He came and stood before him and said, Now I know that there is no God in all the earth except in Israel. Please accept a present from your servant.
Yeah, so he wanted to give all of that wealth to Elisha. And he believed now. He had experienced the healing of our Lord. So basically, Naaman had been converted. from being an idol worshiper to believing that there is one God, the God of Israel.
One of the other things that struck me in this is that when he goes back to the prophet, he doesn't go back by himself. It's very specifically says he goes back with all of his company. And that to me is almost a mark of his humility, that he's learned humility, because he values all these servants that he brought, who were the ones that were responsible for him actually receiving the cure, for getting him to the river. He takes them with him back to the prophet to make his declaration.
It's almost an act of respect
Yes.
for the prophet.
Yes.
Because they all witnessed this curing.
Yes.
It was the obedience that healed him. He was obeying God.
Yeah.
7 days is 7 of completion, so obedience.
Yes.
But he said, and this is Elisha, as the Lord lives, whom I serve, I will accept nothing. Naaman urged him to accept, but he refused. So Elisha, he's a simple man. He has no need for all of this wealth. And he's the Lord's prophet. He will look to the Lord to provide for him. So he's not interested. And he tells Naaman, you keep it.
Then Naaman said, if not, please let 2 mule loads of earth be given to your servant, for your servant will no longer offer burnt offerings or sacrifice to any god except the Lord. So here he's making a statement of faith and a vow of obedience, a vow to only worship the God of Israel. So he's going back to another country. And this is basically a primitive belief that gods were associated with nations. This is the God of Israel. It's how it's always referred to. If you're God of Israel, you worship in Israel, and on the soil of Israel. And if you're going to worship the God of Israel somewhere else, the belief was you took some of that soil back, and that was how you properly worshiped that God. It was just a belief they had at the time. But this is his way of thinking ahead, of planning. I'm going back to another country. I need to do this in order to stay obedient to my vow to worship this God. Shows his commitment.
Yes. There's an interesting little codicil here. He says, but may the Lord pardon your servant on one count. When my master, who is the king, goes into the house of Rimmon to worship there, which is the idol worshiping, leaning on my arm, and I bow down in the house of Rimmon. When I do bow down in the house of Rimmon, may the Lord pardon your servant on this one count. So it's interesting that he knows he's got to go back, and he knows he's got to go through the motions with his king in this idol worship. But he's asking that the Lord will pardon him and know that it's a bogus thing that he's doing. He's not really worshiping.
It's a
yes. Yes.
It's also interesting here because he says these words as though I've had to do this in the past, so I'll have to do it again. And again, you come back to the fact that he had leprosy, and yet the king leaned on his arm. And again, you did not touch people with leprosy, so he really was very favored by his king.
Yes.
Very favored. And Elisha the prophet said to him, go in peace.
So we know that Naaman and Elisha had an interesting encounter between them, because obviously Elisha came out once he was healed, and Naaman was converted to believe in God.
I want to explain one thing in case any of you are wondering. This name is often pronounced Elisha. We get Elijah and Elisha, or Elijah or Elisha. We get them mixed up. But what I did was I have a program called BibleWorks on my computer, and when you read the Old Testament in the Hebrew, you can have it read the text out loud in Hebrew. So I found a place where the prophet's mentioned, and we listened, and it's pronounced Elisha in the Hebrew. Now this may be like Moscow and Moskva. I mean, depends on what language you're speaking, how you pronounce it. But we thought we'd pronounce it the way we heard it in the Hebrew. Elisha.
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 I wish it
So,
Mr. Elisha.
One of the things we're focusing on the Old Testament right now until we get into Advent and we move over and start focusing on Matthew more. But we also are looking towards where does this take us in the New Testament. And there's a lot of healing stories in the New Testament in general, in Matthew in particular. But the stories that we thought of immediately were, the biggest one for me was where Jesus is going along the street and the Roman centurion comes up to him. And the Roman centurion says, I want you to heal my servant. And Jesus says, okay, I'll come. He goes, no, you don't have to come. I know, you could just say the word and he'll be healed. And Jesus says, my God, what faith? What faith? And he sends him away and says, she will be healed. And in that moment, she was healed.
And that was a Roman.
And that was a Roman. And so it kind of strikes as a parallel in several ways. One is, Elisha here is not healing another Israelite. He's healing a guy that just conquered them. He's healing the enemy. And he's doing it not with a lot of standing over and praying or laying hands on or some kind of ritual. He's just speaking the words. He's saying, go out and be healed.
The assurance of faith.
The faith is what we're doing. And it's nice to think that the Roman centurion, who had such faith in Jesus' power, was also converted.
Yes. And there are plenty of stories in the New Testament about the lepers and Jesus' dealings with them.
Touching them.
He touched them. He made them clean. By his word, he would just say, go on, you're healed.
Go give thanks for it.
Yeah. So now, for us, we can look for healing from God through faith. I mean, things are going to happen. We're going to get sick. We're going to have to deal with things. But there is healing through faith. And that healing can take on several. It can be more than just, like the leprosy is gone. It can be a strength of attitude. It can come in a lot of different ways and be healing for you.
There's a holistic healing.
There is. There really is. And I think that that's the story that Naaman brings to us and Elisha, that with faith and understanding, we can go there. We can go there with confidence, without bells and whistles and fancy hoopla. We can go to our God in our faith and be healed.
There's another aspect to this, because there's our faith that God will heal us. And there's also other people's faith. The only reason that Naaman gets there is because of other people's faith. If you remember the story in the New Testament where, and I think it's in Mark, there's a version of it in Matthew, but in Mark, Jesus is in a house and he's talking to people, teaching, and some people are lowering a friend through the roof. Don't go to the architecture from that time and place, but they were lowering someone through the roof to be able to get through, because they couldn't get through the crowd around him. Their faith, when they get him to the ground, Jesus says to the friends, your faith has healed him.
Pick up your bed and
So there's that aspect where as a community, we can heal each other. We can bring each other to healing. And there's many kinds of healing, as we talked about. There's physical healing, and sometimes we're physically healed, but we live in a world where our bodies grow old, our bodies are injured. God can heal, but there's laws of the universe that also...
there's emotional healing.
But there's emotional
Mental healing.
There's, as you said, strengthening of the spirit, many ways to be healed. There's healing with a community. And that's perhaps one of the most important healings that you read about in the Bible at all. Not just that, I'm doing okay now, but I'm all still by myself. As opposed to, I'm healed in the community. So that when I'm with the people who I care about, who care about me, that there's a sense of belonging and there's a sense of love and compassion. if you think about the triune God, we should be studying this on Trinity Sunday, right? Because it's the community that God shows us. The community of God is what's modeled for us to be community of people in God. And God is good.
All the time.
All the time.
God is good.